Okay, we are recording, and I'm going to now share my screen. Okay. So just as a recap, so we've got category A, which we started talking about the last meeting, but kind of ran out of time. So we want to make sure we have some time to revisit this and collect any additional thoughts anyone has on it. And then we'll get into the new categories B and E. So I think what I'll do, if it works for all of you, is kind of go section by section, and then we'll ask the question, to get your feedback on, which are priorities, which are important but longer term priorities, and then anything that should be removed. And then once we get to the end of like category A, I'll ask the question of what are we missing? And for those members of the public who are joining in, just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, to jot them down, and there'll be an opportunity for you to share your ideas towards the end of the meeting. Okay, so let's get started with this category A. So expanding zoning permissions for housing development. So some of this may be a little bit of repeat, but I think it's worth just to make sure we are not missing anyone's feedback. So this A1 was about reducing minimum lot sizes. And then we had a handful of strategies here about, reducing lot sizes for single family detached in low density districts. A1-2 is about reducing minimum lot sizes for townhouses to 2,000 square feet or smaller. A1.3 is about reducing minimum lot sizes for things like duplexes to match that of single family homes. A1-4 is about introducing minimum lot sizes for triplexes and quadplexes, where proposed in low and or medium density zones. And A1.5 is about creating a new R1 2.5 zone with a 2,500 square foot minimum. So I'll open it up for any thoughts on priorities, not priorities, and so forth.
So for me, number 4, this is John Blum. For me, number 4, I think would be a priority from this group, just in terms of ease of being able to make those changes and potentially get more options to the market sooner. I think that one is kind of the low-hanging fruit as I'm looking at these.
Okay. Anyone else, any thoughts on this bucket of strategies?
For me, I also like the second one. I think encouraging more townhouses and townhouse type developments also provide different options for folks, and having some flexibility there, I think would also help.
Okay, wonderful.
And I wonder if
the second.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I wonder if A1 would improve access for older adults as they're looking to downsize and looking to increase housing options that might be available for them.
Okay.
And I was going to say the second bullet of A1, I think cottage housing is a term that confuses people. And so if we can find a way to get to that type of development without using the term cottage housing, I think would be effective. And there have been some challenges with implementation of that and the number of hoops that have to be jumped through to get that density bonus. So if there was a way to do it more efficiently and kind of reach that same goal, I think that would be good.
Okay.
And it seems to me like A1 or like number 1 and number 5 are pretty closely related in terms of, create a new zone, but it also accomplishes the reducing lot sizes.
Okay, great. I'm going to move to the next section, but if you think of anything else, feel free to bring it up as we keep going. All right, so A2 is about requiring a minimum density. And so there's a strategy here on increasing the minimum density in high density zones, where it's currently about 47 to 60%, to a 60 to 80% of the maximum density in terms of where that minimum density threshold is. So this is intended to support multifamily, residential, and potentially smaller housing units. So any thoughts on this strategy, on priority, not a priority, any other nuances you'd like to add?
My only concern with this one, I think it has good intentions. I would worry, are there unintended consequences when you get to things like lot dimensions of trying to fit in when you have minimum and maximum width for individual lots? Sometimes parcels don't lay out nicely to be able to put, nice square lots on there. And then also with environmental constraints, how does that factor in? Are we talking about off of net usable, and what exactly does that mean? And then when you layer that on top of just the, plain Tetris with lots, try and fit them all in there, then you have environmental constraints. I like the idea of the policy. I would just want to be careful that it doesn't create unintended consequences and keep housing from coming that could come otherwise.
Got it, thank you. Anyone else, any other feedback on this one? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Okay. So then we've got a strategy A3 about density limits. So the strategy is to revise the maximum density standard to align with revisions to minimum lot sizes. So this is including greater maximum densities for select middle housing types, or you could remove the maximum density for those housing types in favor of allowing minimum lot sizes to control development intensity. So any thoughts on this one? Priority, not a priority, or other feedback?
This would be a low priority for me. I feel like the market generally already does this.
Okay. All right. Unless anyone has any other feedback, I'll go to the next item. Okay, so A4 is about upzoning, and there's a couple of strategies in here. I'm gonna scan through here. Okay, so we've got 4.1, which is about designating additional land for high density residential uses, which would support things like multifamily development. And so this could either be focused on land, that's already in the urban growth boundary now, or this could be a strategy that's focused for future urban growth boundary expansions with new land coming in. A4.2 is about designating additional land for medium density residential to support a range of more dense and more varied housing types relative to low density areas. And similarly, this could either be focused on land already in the urban growth boundary, or could just be focused on any new land that comes into the boundary in the future. Strategy A4.3 is about developing and applying an R1 2.5 zone for low density residential that permits a range of middle housing development at higher average densities relative to your existing low density residential zones and development patterns. So that one's kind of similar to some of the things we already talked about in the I think it was the first batch of strategies. And then this last one here is about, so counties and cities need to adopt housing affordability metrics as part of the next comprehensive plan update under new state mandate. And these metrics are going to be reported on the buildable lands report, and jurisdictions are going to have to take reasonable measures to meet the housing affordability metrics if they're not being met. So all the jurisdictions in the county, there's a countywide planning policy that has a 75-25 split, with single family detached housing making up 75% of housing types and alternatives making up 25%. And so the strategy here is, should all of the jurisdictions revisit the split during the next comprehensive plan update to see if it still makes sense or not. Okay, so for these 4 ideas, are any of these priorities? Are any of these that, are longer term, maybe not urgent priorities? And should any be removed from consideration?
I think long-term 4.1, 4.2, I would probably weight 4.2 a little bit higher than 4.1. But I think looking particularly on the 179th Street area where all of that land just came into the, or just had urban holding listed, and you don't have to worry as much about interaction with existing neighborhoods, that'd be an area to look at for upzoning.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of number 4, that I think it probably makes sense to just take a look at that 75-25 ratio, if that's serving, our density needs, and whether we do need to take a second look at that. I think we're pretty close to that, aren't we? When we looked at what we're actually building, aren't we right near there?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And again, the 3, considering that R1 2.5 zone, I think is something we should consider.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the upzoning strategies? Okay. Move on to A5. So here we've got a whole bunch of strategies that are around, increasing allowed housing types, either in existing or proposed zones. So I'll just run through those quickly. So these are, mostly getting at middle housing types. So we've got A5.1 about permitting duplexes throughout the low density residential zones. Currently, duplexes are allowed on corner lots in the R16 and R15 zones. So this would be expanding where they're allowed. A5.2 is about introducing triplex and quadplex uses in low and medium density zones and permitting them on minimum lot sizes or densities analogous to townhouses. And these could be allowed outright through a building permit with review without requiring separate land use review. And we could look at either attached or detached configurations. A5.3 is about allowing townhouses in low density zones on lots 2,000 square feet or smaller. A5.4, introducing courtyard apartments to allow small scale apartment development of 5 to 12 units in medium density zones. And we could come up with design standards for that. A5.5 is about allowing and encouraging internal conversion of existing homes into additional units as a plex or a cottage cluster, which could include non-conforming development. And we'd need to consider a bunch of standards on, how to make that make sense and how to meet things like parking needs and things like that. And then A5.6 is about limiting single family detached uses in medium density zones. You could either say they're not allowed there or just limit them to a certain portion of a PUD development to help encourage other types of housing to get built in those medium density zones. All right. Oh, and then there's 2 more strategies. So 5.7 is about limiting townhouse uses in high density zones. So again, this could be, you could say they're not allowed in high density zones, or you could limit them to a portion of a PUD development. And again, this would be, if you wanted to see other types of housing being built in high density zones, you could do that. And then A5.8, as an alternative to permitting outright across low density zones, we could develop a middle housing overlay for low density areas that, so certain parts of low density areas could allow middle housing types on either smaller lots or at greater density. So you could, for instance, target areas near transit or near other amenities like parks and commercial areas, versus, maybe allowing these types of housing across the board in all low density zones. All right, so thoughts on these 8 strategies? Any of them priorities? Any ones you want to drop off the list? Anything important but maybe longer term?
I might have some concerns with permitting duplexes without any other, on any residential zone. I think there may be some additional problems we would get into there. Potentially, I think we should be careful about that one. And I would say the same with number 2. I think we need to find ways to build those, but I think we have to, I don't know that I think just allowing them anywhere might be an issue.
Okay. Right.
And secondarily, sorry, I would, where we have the opportunity on number 4 to introduce smaller apartment type units from that 5 to 12 or 14 range or whatever, I think there could be a nice opportunity there.
Okay, thank
Both
you.
from a developer standpoint, you can get some smaller developers that are, willing to get into the market and build something, or mom and pop developers, frankly, that could get in there and build something rather than a massive apartment complex.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts on these strategies to get at middle housing types?
I do think that 5.8 is a good policy that addresses some of the concerns that Councilor Olson raised.
Okay. Right, I'll go to the next batch of strategies. A6 is about offering density or height incentives for desired unit types. So we've got a strategy here about offering a density or height incentive for larger multifamily projects. So this would be projects, more than 13 units in a high density zone. And you could, it could be based on something like residents served by age or income or abilities, or based on the location if it were near transit or other types of amenities. Is this a priority or not really? And it's okay to not have an opinion also.
I would make this a relatively low priority.
Got it.
Agreed.
Okay. Next batch, A7, is about expanding residential uses in commercial zones. So there were 2 ideas in here. Oh gosh, sorry. So one was, expanding options on how you could build residential in commercial zones. So as was just talked about with the full group, Elizabeth was explaining, in most cases you can build residential above commercial, but we don't tend to see a whole lot of that get built in the county. So this would be, you could consider other options if you could build maybe horizontally with, commercial along the main street with residential behind it, perhaps. And let's see. So things like that. But, you need to figure out how to make it work with either certain design standards, or do you only allow it in certain circumstances when the residences are, it's low income residents or older residents, something like that. And then another strategy here is, should rezoning selected commercial properties for a higher density residential use be considered? So that could either be through a county-led process or it could be on a, property by property basis when property owners request it, and go through the county's process to change their zoning. Or you could develop, criteria to do that. All right, thoughts on these two strategies as a priority or not?
I'm gonna say not for me generally. But this is a constant battle we have on account, as you know, just how to, once those commercial parcels are gone, they're gone. And if we're going to continue to have, if we just are a bedroom community with rooftops and we don't have a good viable business and commercial activity, it's going to just put a lot of other pressures on the community that I think would not be good. So 7.2, I don't really like. The other one, I'm not, I'm interested in whether if the market would drive that, if it were allowed this, because you're taking I don't really have a good visual of what that might look like if we were to go horizontal rather than vertical. And John, maybe you do, but I have a harder time thinking that is affordable for somebody to build.
So my only thoughts on that would be there could be cases where it would work really well, but I think it's not enough of them to justify doing it. One reason it would help is that from a financing perspective, if it's a mixed use building, that makes your financing a little more complicated. Whereas if you can do two separate buildings, one commercial, one residential, getting a loan to do that is a little bit easier. And then just for certain partial dimensions, like if there's not a whole lot of frontage, it can make sense to have like a coffee shop on the frontage and then apartments in the back. But that being said, I think there's too few examples to make it worth the administrative effort.
Okay. All right, any other thoughts on this one? Or should I keep going? Okay. Keep going. Okay, so that was through all the category A, that list. So I just want to ask, when you think about the main sort of topic about expanding zoning permissions for housing development, so where you can build what, are there any other strategies that you've thought of that you think we should add to this list? Oh, Mark, are you trying to talk? Let's see.
I am.
Oh, there you go.
See my picture again. So, oh, here we go. You guys, somehow you're off the camera here. Let me see what's going on. So, Jenna, just help me understand, why did we go through this exercise today? Because from my understanding and reviewing last month's meeting, and I'll just tell you that the video for the other breakout group is not accessible. I really want to see that. But my point being that energy has been put into creating a matrix that, in my mind, gives us a pretty good straightforward assessment as to feasibility, if you will, and a lot of great ideas. So is the objective here today to try to whittle this list down more? Don't tell me that's the case, but I'm getting the sense that's the case, and I'm trying to understand, if that's so, why?
Yeah, so I think the main idea, Mark, is we have a lot of strategies. So last meeting, this meeting, and next meeting, right? We're basically walking through chunks of a very long strategy list, right? And we've created the matrix based on the objectives of interest. And so the idea then is to go, so we've got this long list, and now it's let's start talking about them, because for some people, and maybe your take is, well, I'm going to focus on the matrix to weigh in on what's important, and what makes the most sense. Maybe not.
That's not my take, but regardless, Go ahead and say what you want to say.
So that's a tool. So I think what we're trying to do is, where should we go deeper? Where do we need to, what should go forward? And should we do some more research in to flesh out these ideas further, right? Because I think these are pretty high level ideas right now, right? So if we're gonna as a group, right, land with a bunch of recommendations, we're going to need to be a bit more specific by the end of this process. So this is first cut of, here's the list, you know, to start with. Give us your feedback on what seems like a priority or what doesn't, because I think it's going to be very hard for us to move all of these strategies forward as recommendations to council, because we're going for things that can be implemented as soon as this group finishes their work, right?
And as I look at the assessment and the matrix of all of these, and whether or not we even have a dialogue about those assessments, but I think one of the key things missing here is the impact. And we've got a lot of items here, very low cost, low effort, can be done in an immediate short time frame. I'm not sure why we'd cut that off. It makes no sense to me that we'd cut any of this off, because, and we don't have the resources to make that kind of a whittling decision. That really becomes an implementation based on monitoring and evaluation of some set criteria. So in my mind, these should all stay on the table, because until we've implemented any of them, we have no idea to what level of success impact they're going to have. So it really becomes problematic when we sit here at this stage in this process and operating at this scale and start whacking things out that could have huge impacts. And most of what I hear are rationales for why we shouldn't consider that. Well, that rationale is based on the history of how the system has worked. And that's not going to change until you go in and shift the system and see, did it make a difference? And so I'm a little bit disturbed by the whole process of trying to whack out, look, these all look like extremely viable options that should be concerned. Implementation has to be made by the decision makers as to how we're going to implement that. Now, if you want to refine these and say we got a lot more support here politically or whatever it might be, that's fine. Point is, these should all be implemented to some scale and level over some accountable time frame. So, you know, I'm telling you that after going through this with the city 5 years ago, a couple years before that with the County Commission on Aging, we're going down the same darn path. And what's happened because of it?
All right. Thank you for sharing. I am not sure I'm in a position to change trajectory right now.
Well, I'm not saying you are. I just want you to hear where I'm coming from.
Yeah, but I appreciate hearing that, and have noted it, and we'll relay it to the project team.
The other thing I would say is that many of these strategies should not be blanket applied. And I think that's setting ourselves up for unintended consequences. I think they should be applied specifically on projects that are looking to pursue affordable housing opportunities. So, you know, we need to make some decisions about how do we incentivize this, because the market's not responding until we create an opportunity for the market to respond. And much of what you're seeing here are opening doors for new market opportunities, not the existing system play, because that system is going to continue to do what it's doing until we change it. But the key challenge here is we create market capacity to attend to these opportunities.
Right.
Yeah, and Mark, thanks for that. Also, I would only add that that the only way they get implemented is if the council passes them and changes the code. And so, you know, putting a whole bunch of options out there, just, I don't know that allows a process in which anything can get done. So I don't think taking or eliminating is the goal, but prioritizing in terms of what we think we can get done and what we can actually do and get passed through the council to change the code. That would just be how I see it.
That's a very realistic perspective, I think, Julie, and it's one that you have to abide by. It doesn't mean that the community can't have a different response and do some things differently. So we just do what we can do. It's just that we need to realize that this systemic inclination is what's created the problem in the first place. So.
All right, thank you both. Anyone else have any other thoughts, either things missing or overarching comments on this category A? Okay, so we've got still a good chunk of time to talk about the other strategy buckets. Is there any preference if we go to, we've got funding options, then we've got other, regulatory strategies. Any preferences on the order in which we discuss those?
I think funding options might have some interest for me.
Okay, well, we can.
Both of them do, but.
Yeah, well, I think if everyone's okay with that, we can start with E, and then with whatever time left, we'll get to B and hopefully get through both of them. So I'm gonna go down here. Okay. So funding options, and most of these are funding options for affordable housing. So this E1, there's a lot of background information in this one. I'm not sure if you all had a chance to look at it on different, essentially locally controlled funding options on, some possible taxes or levies. I think Steve mentioned things the county already does do, like collects REAP 2 and lodging tax. Anyway, so there's just a lot of background there. The one strategy on the list right now is actually related to impact fees, and that you could potentially scale them for different sized units, perhaps as a way to incentivize the building of some smaller units. But with impact fees, as I think many of you know, if you reduce or waive impact fees, that cost is going to need to be offset somehow, because the funding is still needed for what those impact fees are paying for things like roads and school facilities and so forth. So, so I guess curious on whether this strategy E 1.1, if that seems like a priority or not, or if there's anything else related to some of this background information up here too, while I have it up. If you think any of these other financing tools that the county doesn't maybe use, if any of those are of interest, that would be good to hear as well.
Jenna,
Yes.
I'm curious as you referred to this idea of reduction of impact fees based on the value, is the converse being considered as well, that larger valued units would actually pay a larger share of the impact fee to make up for, if not generate even more revenue rather than a parcel by parcel? How's that play out?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea, Mark, to add related to the strategy, that I think the general idea is to scale it, but like you're saying, if perhaps it's less for smaller units, that means you need to increase it for larger units. So I think, again, that detail, we're not at that level of detail, but I'm noting down that idea as a possible option.
Well, in my mind, part of this strikes at the equity question about who pays for what. How do we finance a lot of these things we've grown accustomed to? And, up until the point where funding became a challenge, nobody paid much attention. But we've got a lot of regressive components to our policies. So what can we do to spread the wealth a little more equitably, I think is what we're talking about.
Great, thanks. Right. Any other thoughts on either this impact fee strategy or any of these other financing tools that are listed up here?
Jenna, do we have the ability locally to implement like a phased impact fee, or would that require a change in state law?
Okay, I'm not totally positive, but off the top of my head, my understanding is I think there's some flexibility in how you do your determination of what the impact fees are. So I think we could look into various options on how to do that. But I'm not sure, John, of like all the limitations, exactly the bounds of that without doing more research.
No problem. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay.
So one of the things I wanted to bring up, Jenna, and I guess I would say it probably falls under E5, which is the least spoken to, but probably has the most huge opportunity, although you really kind of qualified it to simply private sector funds. I mean, public sector funds, but I think a key piece of this is community investment funds. And, if we're really struggling for capital to make some of these projects pencil from a community improvement standpoint, community development and economic development in our less affluent areas, then looking at opportunities along those lines with some of these private sectors, community foundation and whatnot, they are currently in the process of exploring how to set up a more rigorous community investment fund approach. So communities that have really taken off with this affordable housing fund have done that in co-partnership with those sorts of entities. And then there are tons of corporate entities out there that are looking for communities that are wanting to step up and responding to those communities that have actually walked through this process and have started to implement some things. So we need to get a little more beef in that piece if it fits in there, because it really comes down to how do you build community capacity around community development, and that's certainly what we're talking about here. When we talk about low and middle income community development work, we need some huge capacity support.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I've noted that down because you're right that the private funding isn't really listed here. And
one other idea that comes to mind is Community Reinvestment Act money. All the banking institutions are charged with reinvesting a certain amount of their proceeds back into some of these areas. That's a huge, you look at the amount of capital that comes into this community through all of the banking institutions that operate out of Clark County. There's certainly some direction that could be made there, and that's a little bigger chunk there to bite on, but the whole heart of it is intended to fuel this sort of investment that we're talking about. So
great, thank you. Okay, so other strategies on the list here, we've got establishing a local housing trust fund. This is not something the county currently has. And I'll do E3 too at the same time. And then E3 was about found land. So looking for public land that could be donated or leased to affordable housing developers. So are either of those strategies a high priority, maybe not a high priority, or other feedback related to them?
One of the things, go ahead, somebody else is going to speak.
No, go ahead, Mark. Councilor Olson said she'd wait.
Okay. So in some of the dialogue that happened at last month's meeting, there was some discussion about faith-based projects, and they call out particularly the home share program that Faith Partners for Housing is implementing. On a bigger scale, a big piece of the Faith Partners for Housing agenda is mobilizing church entities to themselves become developers. And there's a number of examples of that playing out in the metro area. And so a piece of that, I think, would be tied to that would be tied to found land is the opportunity for jurisdictions to partner either through a nonprofit or the jurisdiction itself, depending on what the nature of the agreement would be, but to become a co-partner in helping a faith entity develop some property. And that in itself provides those jurisdictions huge flexibility in terms of what might be done on a site as opposed to what they can do by themselves, because the state does provide pretty exceptional latitude for faith bodies to do some development work. So I could see how that would be a win-win sort of scenario on many fronts, and particularly in generating some demonstration projects, because I think a piece of this is we've got to find a way to partner across some of these institutional sector boundaries and demonstrate to people the doability. And so for the city and or county to step up and particularly pick a project that's in the GM growth management area, or it could be a partnership between the city and county, because ultimately that land's going to become city land. Makes total sense to me. Why wouldn't you partner with them for a long run strategy? But I just see how those are some great opportunities. And we've got probably 6 or 7 large denominations right now that if an entity like the county and city with a nonprofit developer approached them along these lines, you'd have a winner.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, and I know there's been some recent legislation increasing some flexibility for faith groups on what they can build, on their land. Anyone else, any other thoughts on either the local housing trust fund or the surplus land idea? Councillor Olson, were you going to say something before? Okay. All right, I'll keep going. So E4 was about partnering with local housing providers. Again, our community services department, my understanding is already has pretty good relationships with the public and nonprofit providers in the county, but has identified that they don't work a whole lot with for-profit developers trying to do affordable housing. So any ideas on if there's other areas you think, the county should be focused on and improving partnerships, with folks building housing in the county? That would be good to hear about. And then also include E5 for enhancing partnerships around mission-oriented acquisition funds, which is focused on, acquiring or rehabilitating low-cost market rentals in exchange for affordability restrictions. So any thoughts on either of those two?
It seems to me that there would be a great opportunity. I can think of a half a dozen builders right now, developers who we could sit down with some of these proposals and work up a pro forma with them right now on some specific housing types. And I'm talking about some of the developers that are already inclined towards affordable housing investments, but they see many of these barriers that really preclude the scope of their investment in that. But to sit down with a half a dozen of them and create some projects that in their mind, this would be a great project for the community. And we'd vet that a little bit, but then have them put some packages together based on some of these proposals. And we put them into a demonstration investment sort of a thing. So, and you'd have to set it up where the risks are all attended to up front, but we've had to do some stuff along those lines. We've got to create some demonstrations that with people who are early adopters already, and start to show that hey, there's some huge benefits out here we haven't even considered because we never did it.
Yeah,
So
I agree with Mark on that. I think there's a nice opportunity here to do some things that we've not done before, to look at things in a different way. And I think getting feedback from these developers on, how do we put that together is the best way to get started having those conversations. Because certainly I don't think we could say, here's how we should do it. But I think let's just get these conversations started with these guys, and they're as creative as anyone else and really know where the barriers are. But I think this is something that has a lot of upside opportunity if we can get some examples like Mark was saying. So
Great. Thank you.
This resonates with me as well.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, keep us moving. And then E6 is the last one in this section, which is, it's really a long list of state and federal funding tools that are or have been available. So the county administers some of these, but some of these other tools are, financing tools are more geared towards the private or nonprofit sector and how they would fund their projects. So we've got this long list of tools, and I guess there's not actually a specific strategy here. So if anyone has any ideas on something we could do in relation to, these funding sources that are available, that would be great to hear for this E6.
The community land trust model is one I think that fits in here in some way as well when we talk about funding options in terms of creating a land trust that acquires property for this specific purpose and then administers that property, over a long-term period of time. And I think, there's some melding of that with the community investment fund approach as well, which is helping to create new wealth and build wealth building capacity at a community scale. So I think that the cost of land is a key piece of this thing. And I think part of our ultimate strategy is going to have to be that we have an entity that helps us, whether it's Columbia Land Trust or some other entity that, and Habitat for Humanity's moved in that direction. They're now making the land trust model their standard. And that's a lot of habitat chapters do that. It's their discretion of whether or not they do. But I think something on a much broader scale is really in order, and as well as helping Habitat to move that to the next scale too. So.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else, any thoughts on these state and federal funding tools? Okay. All right, before we go to the category B, I'll just open it up for any other strategies that we seem to be missing related to funding options for affordable housing that have not already been raised. Okay. Sorry for all the scrolling. All right. So our last batch of strategies then to talk about are these additional things related to various development regulations, which Elizabeth talked through earlier. So B1, this one is all about things we could change related to parking requirements. There's a whole long list of ideas here that she talked through. Did any of these stand out to you as seemed like a really high priority, or ones that you had questions about, or any feedback on these ideas about parking?
So without offering any specific, I'm just going to say that this is a very, I think we talked about this last time, this is a really touchy topic. And people get assaulted and shot over parking spots. So I think we have to be really careful about how we think about reducing parking. And I understand the desire for for fewer cars and more mass transit and more public transportation, and that's great. But that's not a panacea for everyone. It's not an end all for everyone. So this is a really, really touchy topic, and I would be personally, I think we'd be very careful about how we address this topic. And going too far, I think would be a problem. And I already said I have no solutions. I just have reservations.
But that's totally fair. Anyone else, any initial thoughts or feedback on this list of parking ideas?
My thought is that at the very least, we should have as much flexibility as possible without making it too complex to implement. But there's far too many projects that ultimately would be viable for a lot of reasons, but they don't meet the standard for parking. And we've got to start biting the bullet at some point, saying, okay, well, let's go ahead and do it. But I hear what Julie's saying. I mean, it goes right to the heart of our whole individual mindset. So it's going to be a long haul on that one. But from a site-by-site standpoint, I think there needs to be as much flexibility as possible.
All right. Any other thoughts on parking? I guess I'll keep us moving. Okay, so B2, these were, this is sort of another batch of strategies relating to ground floor commercial. I think as we've already talked about, you can build residential above commercial, but perhaps there's a way this strategy B2.1 is about, do we need to build in more flexibility into what uses are considered okay as ground floor commercial or in mixed use zones? For instance, does it have to be a standard retail type environment, or could it be something else that's like, if it's a community room associated with the residences, could that be an okay use on the ground floor in a commercial space? So expanding sort of how that's defined. B2.2 is about adding flexibility in commercial zones around horizontal configurations. So we also kind of talked about this a bit already. And then 2.3 is about, exploring options on how you could increase access to neighborhood scale retail and services, things like a neighborhood coffee shop, that you can walk to from your house. I think we've had an advisory group member mention that they have a neighborhood commercial zoned area near where they live, but nothing's been built there. So is there a way to help bring some neighborhood commercial services near where residences are being built? Any thoughts on these strategies related to commercial requirements? Are they a priority? Are they not? Other feedback?
I like B2.3. I think adding some flexibility there with the neighborhood commercial zoning, I think would also help get those other zone sites moving potentially. So I like that.
Yep.
I agree. I like the walkability option for folks who may have limited transportation or who are just wanting to have more accessibility within the neighborhood.
Great.
Then the only thing I would say about the top one, I don't have an issue with it per se. I just want to make sure that we don't give away all of our commercial and job producing, even though most of service jobs are still jobs. So that'd be my only issue there, is just to make sure there's some boundaries.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. B3 is about simplifying design standards. So there's a few ideas here. We could go back into the Highway 99 plan to look at the residential areas and look at reducing the complexity, while still promoting the desired built form. So for instance, we could consider exempting mixed residential areas from any additional Highway 99 zoning provisions, and or relying on existing county development standards for certain middle housing types. So for instance, the Highway 99 plan, when it talks about cottage housing, it says, see this code section, like the standard code section for cottage housing versus having a different set of standards. B 3.2 is about revising cottage housing standards. I think John mentioned earlier, there's been some issues with implementation around the cottage housing. So looking at how can we increase development feasibility while also still providing a coherent site design and a balance of amenities, so things we could consider on, it's allowing increased density, can we permit a greater variety of the types of attached or detached units that can be in a cottage cluster around a common space, while also accommodating a wider range of where you could park vehicles near the cottages. Anyway, there's a lot of considerations there, but revisiting the standards around cottage housing to increase flexibility as much as possible, but also making sure it still has that intent of feeling like a low density development. And then B 3.3, in looking at the larger multifamily projects. So these are typically in our higher density zones, and looking at the open space requirements to make sure they're not creating a barrier to the number of units that are getting built. So for instance, could consider exempting any units over the minimum density from triggering additional open space requirements or something like that. So any thoughts on these strategies as priorities or additional feedback?
Again, I'll start with number one. I think absolutely we need to revise and at least relook at the Highway 9. In fact, we need to look at the whole Highway 90 main sub-area plan. And that's not to criticize any of the work that's been done previously, but in the desire to have this area build and grow and develop, there's so much restriction and barriers put up that it just hasn't materialized, I think, the way that we thought it would. So I would definitely look at that. I mean, gosh, just thinking about sidewalks, the plan calls for 8-foot sidewalks. We can't get grant funding for 8-foot sidewalks. We can only get grant funding for 6-foot sidewalks. So why do we have 8-foot sidewalks in the plan? So that's just an example of off-topic example. But I think definitely number one, I think would be an easy one to get started. Oh, well, not the whole plan, but at least this part of it. And I think as well, I just think we can look at all of these things, but with everything, there have to be some, we don't want to give away all the open space and recreation requirements, but what impact would that have on additional units at a particular development? I think those are the questions that I would have.
Great, thank you. Anyone else, any thoughts on these strategies? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I think we're gonna get pulled back fairly soon. So B4 is about revising EDU standards. So thoughts on if it's worth revisiting those to build in some more flexibility as well.
Yeah, I think they can be reviewed. I think we have to be careful about how much we open this up. I mean, even doing what we did, we have to make sure that we maintain the quality of these neighborhoods while we try to address housing shortages. But I'm not objecting to looking at them, but I think we have to be careful about what we think we might want to loosen up there.
Okay. And then B5 is about manufactured homes and tiny house communities. So we've got two strategies here. One is to do something that would provide some extra protection to existing manufactured home parks, which are pretty vulnerable to displacement. So such as you could put a zoning overlay on them or a specific zone, or the other one about increasing options for allowing RVs or tiny homes, on people's residences. We have 20 seconds if anyone wants to chime in with any final thoughts on that.
I like number two for sure.
Okay.
For sure. The overlay I think we'd have to dig into a little bit further.
Okay.
Yeah, Community Roots has got a great project out there that's going to show us a lot of things. So I'm excited to see that. We've got Dan Whiteley on the PAG. So.
Okay. It looks like everyone is back or in the process of returning. I accidentally scheduled those meetings for about 10 minutes longer than they should have been. So we're thus behind on our agenda. I apologize, but I don't think it's too big of a problem. Let's just do a quick report back, maybe on 1 to 3 key ideas that each group seemed to gravitate towards the most. And Elizabeth, could we start with you?
Sure thing, Steve. So my group talked a lot about the regulatory strategies, both going back over A and then into B. So certainly we're interested in some changes to commercial, the requirements in the commercial zones, but then extending sort of the mirror image of that to both to compensate, but also just to add vitality to neighborhoods by integrating those neighborhood commercials into residential areas. So if more residential is in commercial, then more commercial could be permitted in residential as well. So ways to make that work, but also recognizing that, you know, prevailing market patterns have been a little bit different for the last 10 years. And so there've been some challenges getting those developed. But I would say overall, we had a really interesting conversation about how can we change some of the paradigms that we're working in. So we thought about that also in terms of parking, about how could we use things like transit? How could we think about things like car sharing, pooled resources as ways to build towards the future and create some opportunities in the code, as well as modifying options for today for the different housing types we're trying to build. And let's see, also just talked a lot about what cottages could be like and how making development smaller scale could meet a variety of different needs, both in making homeownership affordable on small scales, also meeting needs of some of our aging in place for some of our older residents in the community, and ways to keep all the amenities and quality of life, but in a different size and more intelligently configured package, rather than just adding endless square footage that is poorly designed. So that's some of the bigger trends that we talked about, but good conversation.
Great, thank you. Jenna.
All right, we had a lot of good feedback. A few things that are top of mind from all of the things we talked about. I think there was an interest in reviewing, you know, a lot of the code and development standards around things like Highway 99, where we maybe have different standards for some types of residential development compared to the standard code. And, you know, how can we simplify there? And I think sort of there's an overarching theme of how do we increase flexibility, but also make sure we're really clear on where the boundaries are for a lot of the stuff that we talked about. But that's this idea of revisiting some of the code language around cottage housing and ADUs to see if there is any other flexibility we can build in while still, you know, not causing a lot of unintended consequences. Also had some discussion about partnerships, you know, with private development community, with faith-based community. I think that came up when we were talking about things like surplus land, and that, or even just testing out some of these ideas, that there's an opportunity to build those relationships and maybe find some new opportunities that way. And then I think one of the things that stood out to me when we revisited the category A topic was, again, I think some interest in smaller lot options, you know, and that came up in a variety of different ways, but a way to be able to provide that. So there was a lot more discussed, so that's only skimming the surface.
Yes, and of course, that'll be reflected in the summary we put together. I'll add from group one, our group, I think in general, a lot of support for the various strategies, I think most of them in category A, but wanting to understand, and I mentioned to my group that when we come back in October, you know, at this point in time, we've looked at each of these strategies or types individually, but when we come back, we'll want to be looking at things more holistically to make sure that different strategies aren't counteracting one another or trying to achieve the same thing just from different angles. We'll make sure it's a little more comprehensive. In category B, I think there was some hesitancy around reducing off-street parking requirements and maybe things around density bonuses and things of that, but just wanting, or even residential and commercial zones, but more around just wanting to make sure that it's calibrated correctly, that I think several of those strategies mention identifying criteria. So when are these tools appropriate and in what locations, and just being thoughtful about the specifics of those. Also in category B, we talked a lot at the end about manufactured home parks and definitely the importance of protecting those existing parks from displacement. There was also some concern about rent increases. I don't know if that's within our guideposts here, if that's something we can do something about, but that issue was raised as well. But I think the 5.1 really looking at protecting manufactured home parks from displacement is a priority. And then in the funding